This episode was suggested by Tori on Facebook and my husband, David. If you'd like to make a suggestion, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast, on Twitter at Morbid Podcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. In this episode, we'll be going into detail on medicinal bloodletting, the feeding process of leeches, and their medical use, which can get quite graphic. So if that's not something you want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so, the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. How often in a period film or television show has a doctor prescribed bloodletting or a course of leeches to an unwell character? I can think of two examples almost immediately. The 1995 film Sense and Sensibility, set in Regency-era England, and the first episode of Blackadder II, set in the Elizabethan era in England. While the Blackadder scene pokes fun at physicians of the past for prescribing bloodletting by leeches for every single ailment, the scene in Sense and Sensibility is more upsetting, as the modern audience knows the character is very sick and wonders how bleeding is supposed to help. Bloodletting seems barbaric to us today, not only barbaric but illogical. We can't see how the people of the past believed it to be useful, healthy, or revitalizing. To us, it's debilitating, even deadly. Our views are based on modern science, which has proven that blood loss is quite detrimental to human health. It must have been obvious to people of the past that blood was essential to life. They hunted, they spilled animal blood, and saw that large wounds result in blood loss and death. Therefore, we'd expect they would want to retain blood rather than drain it. But for much of Western history, bloodletting was thought to be a healer of all ills. From antiquity to the mid-19th century, it was the most common and most trusted surgical procedure. Why this didn't change with the rise of the study of human anatomy is quite a mystery. It's been hypothesized that people of the past saw that other things were also needed to sustain life, such as food, water, and breath. Blood, and observed changes in it, became a way to determine how a person was, not just that they were alive. Bloodletting for the sake of health, or medicinal bloodletting, is an ancient therapy. It developed alongside the idea that all disease is caused by tainted, impure, or an excess of blood that must be removed to regain health. The first documented references to bloodletting come from the Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of medical documents dated to the late 5th, early 4th century BCE, as well as an ancient Chinese body of medical literature called the Huangdi Neijing, abbreviated as the Neijing, which dates to between 475 BCE and 220 CE. In both bodies of work, bloodletting is mentioned, but does not feature as the cornerstone of medicine. The methods recorded by Hippocrates of drawing out the blood included phlebotomy, also known as venesection, which was the cutting of the veins with a sharp implement, as well as cupping, which used suction to draw blood to the surface of the skin. Both of these processes were done in specific locations for specific symptoms. This type of focused bloodletting is called topological bleeding, as location matters. These locations were called phlebes, and while some were anatomy-based, although the exact path of veins and arteries was unknown at this time, other locations were just believed to be connected to certain body parts by an imagined network of channels. The older parts of the Neijing feature bloodletting more often than the newer parts, which focus more on acupuncture, a bloodless type of surgery involving needles. Like Hippocrates, many of the bleeding sites mentioned in the Neijing were near major arteries, but others were not. Physicians were advised that if any of these sites were misused, great harm could come to the patient. This fear of misusing these sites may well be why bloodletting later faded from Chinese medicine. It's also possible that this network may have inspired the complex network of acupuncture points that developed later. Later Greek and Chinese texts diverge on bloodletting. Galen, the famous Roman physician who wrote between 160 and 217 CE, no longer focused on specific locations where bleeding might aid certain body parts. Where the blood came from mattered far less than getting it out of the patient. This is likely due in part to the spread and expansion of Hippocrates' theory of the 4 bodily humors. The humoral system of medicine, which was extended by Galen, quickly became the going medical theory in the 2nd century CE in the Mediterranean, and lasted in most of the Western world until the 17th century. Many perceived issues with blood could cause all sorts of symptoms, including mental symptoms. In the humoral system of medicine, 4 theoretical vital body fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, existed in the human body, and any imbalance in them could cause disease. These humors also had associated temperaments or behavioral types. Blood was believed to be associated with a sanguine nature, meaning enthusiastic, active, and social, and was considered a moist and warm humor. Yellow bile was warm and dry, and an excess of it was thought to produce aggression. Black bile was dry and cold, and too much of it was thought to cause depression. The word melancholy actually derives from the Greek word for black bile. Phlegm, which is not the same phlegm that we think of today, was a humor thought to be associated with apathetic behavior, and was considered to be a cold and moist humor. It was believed that ingesting different foods could produce different humors in the human body. Seasons of the year, periods of life, geographic regions, and occupations were also thought to influence the nature of the humors. Therefore, disease could be caused and treated by a change in diet, environmental circumstances, location, or by bleeding. Having too much blood was especially considered to cause most disease. This excess of blood was called plethora, and it was linked to almost every ailment. Certain foods could cause it in some people, while not eating certain foods could cause it in others. If the excess of blood wasn't removed, it was thought that the blood could putrefy and cause inflammation or other diseases. This is why removing small amounts of blood became a treatment for so many ailments, and why the location the blood was drawn from no longer mattered as much. Galen wrote 3 works on bloodletting, setting out the theory of how it worked, diagnostic evaluations to determine how much to bleed a patient for their symptoms, and how often to bleed them. He prescribed bloodletting to relieve gout, arthritis, dizziness, epilepsy, melancholy, and even hemorrhaging. He stated that it was an essential remedy and a traditional one, which suggests it became widespread some time before he wrote. The Huangdi Bashi Nanjing, a medical text compiled during the late Han dynasty of China in the 2nd century CE, contains no mentions whatsoever of bloodletting. So between Hippocrates and Galen, bloodletting grew in popularity in the Mediterranean, but faded in the East. These areas shared trade routes, but apparently medical ideas didn't travel as far as goods did. Avicenna, a Persian physician, modernly called the father of medicine, completed his canon of medicine in 1025 CE. In it, he further expanded upon the humors, reiterating that blood was the most important of all. He described how to tell healthy from unhealthy blood, and that the blood becomes unhealthy due to changes in temperament or an excess of other humors. Medieval European physicians received knowledge of bloodletting and leeches from translations of Arabic authors like Avicenna. They believed these authors, as well as Greek and Roman authors, were medical authorities, so the tradition of bloodletting continued on. No other treatment was as popular in the Middle Ages. Bloodletting was used to relieve nausea, fevers, constipation, insomnia, and anxiety. Healthy people were also bled prophylactically, or to prevent them from getting sick. At this time, the most popular form of bleeding was by venesection, using a tool called a lancet, which was a small, sharp, double-bladed instrument, or a fleam, which was similar to a pocket knife in that it had a number of small blades, all of which could be folded into a case. Bloodletting over a larger area often involved scarification, scraping the skin with a cube-shaped brass box containing multiple small knives, followed by cupping, which involved placing a dome-shaped glass over the skin and extracting the air from it by suction or heat. Leeches were also used for bloodletting and usually involved the medicinal leech, Hirudo medicinalis. Use of leeches became hugely popular in the late 18th, early 19th century, especially in France and England. I'll go deeper into the use of leeches after the ad break. By the 16th century, there was some debate over whether bloodletting was as useful as previously believed. Still, use of bloodletting continued. William Harvey's 1628 discovery that blood circulated through a system of veins and arteries, as opposed to the previous theory that the system was one way, didn't alter support for bloodletting at first. With the introduction of scientific medicine by way of controlled clinical trials introduced in the late 1600s, seeds of doubt in the benefits of bloodletting began to sprout among the medical community. Even after the humoral system of medicine fell out of favor during the 17th century, bloodletting was still regarded as an effective treatment. It was often recommended by physicians, but the actual procedure was done by surgeons and barber surgeons. The red and white striped pole of the barber is supposedly derived from the practice of bloodletting, with the red representing blood and the white representing bandages. By the 18th century, surgeons were referred to as leeches, as they were the ones who took blood from their patients. The debate over whether bleeding was helpful or actually quite harmful also grew during this century. Dr. Benjamin Rush, an American physician and one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, was one of the more exuberant proponents of bloodletting. He believed that all illnesses that produce fevers were due to, quote, an irregular convulsive action of the blood vessels, end quote. Therefore, all therapy should be directed at calming this vascular overexcitement. He even created a new name for the aggressive bloodletting he prescribed, Depletion Therapy. Dr. Rush removed extraordinary amounts of blood from his patients, causing them to faint, and often bled them several times this way. Many other contemporary physicians referred to his practices as murderous. The beginning of the downfall of bloodletting came with Dr. Pierre Louis of Paris, an analytically minded physician who sought to scientifically assess the effects of bloodletting. He examined 77 of his patients with acute pneumonia, comparing the health of those treated with bloodletting in the early phase versus the same treatment in the late phase of the illness. In his conclusions, he didn't condemn bloodletting, but he did state that it was far less effective than commonly believed. Despite the growth of this debate, in the 19th century, the use of leeches became all the rage when it came to bloodletting. It's thought that, despite new anatomical knowledge, because the cure to disease was still unknown, bloodletting offered a sort of placebo effect for people seeking treatment for a disease that was at the time incurable. Whatever the reason, millions of leeches were harvested and used for medicine in the 1800s. Subsequent research conducted by microbiologist Louis Pasteur, bacteriologist Robert Koch, and others in the late 1800s, early 1900s confirmed that the new scientific methods were far better for the health of their patients, and the use of bloodletting gradually diminished to a few select conditions. As a medical treatment, bloodletting continued to fade in the 19th and 20th century. Today, its only real use is in the treatment of a few rare diseases, such as hemochromatosis, a genetic disorder characterized by excessive intestinal absorption of iron, resulting in a pathological increase in total body iron stores, which can disrupt normal organ function. This disease is treated by weekly to yearly bloodletting, also known as phlebotomy. Unlike bloodletting, however, the use of leeches has continued to this day. Before we get into just what leeches are and how they were used for bloodletting and other medicine, let's pause for a word from our sponsors. Our regular sponsor is Audible.com. Audible can provide you with interesting and engaging audiobooks. In fact, there are over 180,000 of them to choose from, which you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 players. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible.com by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You can also find this link on our Facebook page and website. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, even if you cancel the service as soon as you finish downloading it. And the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. So go get your free audiobook on us. Lastly, if you like this podcast, why not sponsor the MCP yourself by becoming a patron on Patreon? Over 45,000 people download this podcast every month, but only around 140 people are supporting us on Patreon. For a mere $1 an episode, that's $2 a month, you can get ad-free episodes, bonus behind-the-scenes info, give your opinion by answering polls, have access to all the horror story readings, and get updates on past episodes. For $3 an episode, you get monthly outtake reels. For $5, you get a monthly quiz episode where I quiz my husband on past episodes. For $10, you get a detailed bibliography of all the resources I've used while researching an episode. And for $20, you get a bit of miscellaneous morbidity, a short essay on a random morbid topic every month. Previously, we have reviewed horror video games and television shows, discussed the plague pits of London, and tried out historic recipes from previous episodes. All of these rewards aside, your patronage supports the podcast and keeps new episodes coming. I can't keep doing this podcast without you, so go to bit.ly/morbidpatron, that's bit.ly/morbidpatron, to choose your rewards and support the MCP. You'll have my eternal gratitude. And now back to the podcast. For over 2,000 years, leeches have been the only living animals used for treating diseases. Leeches, as you may have gathered, are carnivorous worms that feed on the blood of other animals, including humans. They fall into the phylum Annelida, along with other segmented worms. They're quite interesting creatures, exhibiting many fascinating abilities in the form of secretions that allow them to do what they do. But there is a certain yuck factor, as my high school biology teacher used to say, so if you're squeamish, be prepared to squirm. Among their segments, leeches have 10 stomachs, 32 brains, 9 pairs of testicles, and several hundred teeth. Being carnivorous worms, leeches feed on other animals, with most species consuming blood by temporarily attaching themselves to a host and drinking its blood. Some species are quite picky and will only feed on certain animals, while others are less choosy and will even eat smaller invertebrates. Those that feed on blood often have blade-like jaws to slit holes into the skin of their hosts, while others use enzymes in their saliva to digest a hole into the skin. The host usually can't feel this at all, as the leech also secretes an analgesic, numbing the area that they attach to. After the hole is made, leeches secrete another substance called hirudin, an anticoagulant which deters the blood from clotting. They then ingest the blood of the host using a sucking motion. Most leeches don't harm the host by feeding on them and drop off once they're full. Leeches exist in many habitats, but are most commonly found in freshwater ponds and streams in North America and Europe. The most common species used for medicine, Hirudo medicinalis, can grow to around 5 inches or 12 centimeters in length when stretched out. Their dorsal surface, or their back, is black with yellow streaks, while their ventral side or stomach is gray with black spots. They have 2 suckers on either end of their body. The anterior or front sucker contains the jaws, while the posterior or end sucker is used for movement, which has been described as creeping or crawling when on land and gracefully swimming when in water. Hungry leeches will rest at the edge of their habitat, usually a pond. When they sense vibrations in the water, they swim toward the source with surprising accuracy. Once they are attached, they typically ingest between 5 to 15 milliliters of blood. Some leeches can drink up to 9 times their own body weight, which will feed them for an entire year. The feeding process usually takes between 10 and 40 minutes. Once full, the leech loosens its grip and falls off the host. It won't feed again until its gut is completely empty, which can sometimes take up to 3 months. The site of the bite may bleed freely for between 24 and 48 hours, causing the host to lose far more blood than the meal the leech consumed. If jaws were used to create the wound, usually a small bruise and a Y-shaped scar is left behind. As for leech reproduction, they are hermaphroditic and require another leech to produce offspring. The two creatures exchange sperm packets and then go their separate ways. Most H. medicinalis aren't sexually mature until they are around 7 to 8 years old. One of the first recorded uses of leeches as a medical device comes from a medical poem by Nicander of Colophon, a Greek physician and poet in the 2nd century BCE. Another early mention comes from the Sushrata Samhita, an ancient Sanskrit medical text dating to sometime between the 1st century BCE and the 6th century CE. It describes 12 types of leeches and their uses in the treatment of skin problems, sciatica, and muscle pain. There is evidence that the Egyptians used them too, which may have inspired the Greeks and Romans to do the same. Dioscorides, Galen, and Pliny the Elder all mentioned leeches under the name sanguisuga. Avicenna dedicated several pages of his canon of medicine to the uses of leeches and also described where to collect them. According to him, the perfect leech for medicinal use had to come from a clean water source. The worm must not smell bad and must be kept in a container for a day before applying to a patient. It must also be squeezed before application to force it to expel the contents of its stomach. The leech and the site on the human where it was to be placed both had to be cleaned before application. Also, a thread should be sewn through the tail of the leech to make sure it could be removed if it was placed in an orifice, such as the nose or anus. The fear of a wandering leech was quite high at this time, and Avicenna gave several ways of removing them. If a leech was swallowed, it could be flushed out by having the patient drink salt water and then vomit. If part of the leech was still visible, salt could be applied to its back to make it release its grip, and then drag it out from the orifice using the thread. A leech that wandered into the anus could be removed with a saltwater enema. Abdel Latif al-Baghdadi, an Arabic physician and historian, also described the uses of leeches in the 12th century. His writings describe a more modern use for leeches as a cleaner of tissues and post-surgical aid. As time went on and bloodletting continued to be used, leeches grew to be thought of as a slower, less painful alternative to venesection, and were therefore favored by some physicians, especially for more delicate parts of the body and on young and elderly patients. As I said before, the 17th century is when leeches grew popular as a medical treatment. This craze lasted through the 18th century and grew even more vast in the 19th century in Europe. In his 1776 book on the diseases of children, Niels Rosen von Rosenstein, a Swedish physician and founder of modern pediatrics, described using leeches on child patients for difficult dental eruptions, tooth abscesses, scarlet fever, pleurisy, and inflamed eyes. In 1812, the first leech farm was established in South Wales in the United Kingdom. Victorian-era Britain used around 42 million leeches a year for bloodletting purposes, and around 1/4 of them came from this leech farm. Even after leeches fell out of favor, this farm has continued and even grown in the modern era. More on that in a moment. Francois Joseph Victor Broussais, a revered French physician, was one of the most influential advocates of leeching in France. He felt that leeches could be used to treat all diseases. He applied between 10 and 50 leeches at a time to every patient he saw, using hundreds every day. He treated typhoid, syphilis, tuberculosis, worms, and mental disorders with leeches. Because of his influence, millions of leeches were imported into France. In 1827 alone, about 33 million leeches were shipped to Paris. French noblewomen even wore dresses with embroidery patterns representing leeches. In 1831, physicians in Sweden, which was believed to have the richest source of leeches for medical purposes, tried to impose an embargo on their domestic supply of leeches, as their stock was quickly becoming exhausted due to exportation. The Swedish government declined, but did create a monitoring program to keep tabs on pond populations of leeches. Leech farming was even attempted to aid in keeping the population high. By the late 19th, early 20th century, with bloodletting disproved as a treatment for most things, leeches too declined in popularity. Soon, leeches were only prescribed by so-called quack doctors, whose supplies came not from a pharmacy, but from leech women who caught the leeches by dangling their feet in local ponds. Still, into the 1930s, hospital pharmacies often had a small supply of leeches. These were kept in large glass jars filled with water. Sand coated the bottom of the jar, and the water had to be changed once a week. The leeches were supposedly fed occasionally by medical interns who dipped their toes into the water. In this environment, the leeches could survive for around 8 years. In the 1970s, leeches drew the attention of physicians once more, especially in plastic and reconstructive surgery, which was a growing field at the time. The special secretions of leeches were perfect for reattachment surgeries, such as the reattachment of a lost finger or a skin graft, as the leeches could improve blood flow through suction and their anticoagulant properties. In 1984, the leech farm in Wales, now known as Biofarm, moved closer to Swansea and began raising leeches again due to their reintroduction and growing popularity in medicine. The leeches are bred and raised in 3 large tanks and fed sheep's blood in sausage casings every 6 months. The leeches must also exercise twice a day by moving them around the tanks, causing them to swim. The oldest leeches live in a UV-lit room, which aids in making them as sterile as possible for the hospitals they'll be shipped to. Today, this farm supplies most hospitals in the world that use leeches as complementary medicine. Medical leech therapy, abbreviated as MLT or hyrudotherapy, is done in some hospitals today. The use of leeches has been studied using modern scientific techniques for the treatment of various diseases, such as inflammatory disease, osteoarthritis, and as a post-surgery reattachment aid to increase blood flow to the reattached item, as well as removing accumulations of blood from areas where tissue has been transplanted or reattached. When blood accumulates, the tissue may die before it has a chance to heal. Therefore, applying leeches to the area gives new capillaries time to grow across the sutures and restore blood circulation. It's been found that leeches secrete more than 20 bioactive substances, including hyrudin, when they feed. These substances have various effects, including anticoagulant, analgesic, anti-inflammatory, and antimicrobial properties. It's believed that further study will reveal even more effects that are produced by leech secretions. There's no current consensus on the application and duration of MLT, but most physicians who use it suggest a maximum of 4 to 5 leeches be applied for a maximum of 6 to 8 hours. During this time, clinical monitoring and blood count must be done to make sure the patient isn't suffering any adverse effects, as it has been found that some people are actually allergic to leech secretions. To avoid infection and accidental blood transfusions, each leech is used only one time and is killed humanely using an alcohol solution afterwards. In a 2002 survey of 50 plastic surgery units in the United Kingdom, 80% had used leeches in the previous 5 years. Leeches have made the difference between a successful reconstruction or reattachment surgery and a failed one. While history and modern science has revealed that bloodletting is, for the most part, harmful to humans, leeches, once an instrument of bloodletting, have proven to be the opposite. They have shown their worth to modern medicine in the varied and unique secretions they produce. Still, the yuck factor remains, as they are slimy, blood-sucking worms. This juxtaposition of usefulness and creepiness is why leeches continue to spark our curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media. And please, please, please give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and gave us ratings on iTunes. People like The Glorious Hum, Maricel, Amanda S19, Doodle Girl, Dragon Pixies, Ashley, Jim, Matthew, and Stacy. John Michael, Milady, Cassandra, Heather M., Grace, and Ashley all have my eternal gratitude for becoming patrons. Thank you so much. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and news articles, and share your own creepy stories and cute pet pictures. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give one-time donations by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking the donate button. On our website, you can also find links to all our social media and sponsors, and other ways to contact us. If you'd rather contact us by mail, this address is also listed on the website. Another way to help the show is by going to our Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.